welcome to another episode of Media Unboxed. Today we're going to be unboxing the 2022 Narrative and Ideology SAC, having a look at some of the questions and some common issues people had in completing each of those responses to a high standard. So a little bit of advice, general advice, is just to make sure you're highlighting the key elements of each question. Make sure you're aware of the differences in what the question is asking you so that you can make sure you're refining and adapting your response to the purpose of the question. If you do run out of space, and most likely you will run out of space, make sure you use the extra space by identifying both at the bottom of your response and at the beginning of the extra space what that refers to. And don't just write down the page if you are running out of space and there's only a few lines available. Don't just write several lines below that space. I'll give you an example of that in a second. So the first thing we're going to do is look at question 1. Name 2 media conventions and 2 media codes that were used in one of the narratives you studied this year. So I'm just going to quickly grab the highlighter. So it is obviously 2 conventions and 2 media codes. With the narrative, just make sure you indicate the name of the film plus in brackets the year and director, or director and year. Just whatever you use, make sure you're consistent with that. If you're talking about character development and character establishment or character relationships, just make sure they are not all put on the one line here. Character establishment and development are kind of 2 different things. And the codes, you should ensure that you're very clear. You don't have to necessarily say symbolic code or technical code, but you do need to make sure you're not using, say, camera movement and camera shot types as 2 different codes, because it all falls under the one code of camera. Okay, question 2. Discuss how at least one of the media conventions and at least one of the media codes that you've identified in question 1 have combined to engage an audience. You must use the same narrative as you chose in question 1, so whatever you've chosen here. So a few things about this. It is talking about an audience, so make sure you are defining the audience. So define the characteristics, the demographics, the interests, the background of an audience. So what is the actual audience that's being engaged here? Obviously, we need to make sure we're identifying just one narrative, one media convention, and at least one code. And you really need to look at how they were combined. Sometimes the combination here is the most critical thing. Sometimes what will happen is you'll discuss the 2 conventions and codes separately, and you won't really discuss how they are working together to engage or construct meaning in another type of question. If you're looking to practice a question like this, you really should be mixing up the conventions and codes and maybe mixing up things like engagement and reading. All right, next question. Question 3, describe how character has been established using media codes in one of the media narratives you studied this year. Obviously, you need to use a different narrative to the one in the previous question. So again, write the narrative, include the director and year, and be careful not to just discuss something like character more broadly. So if you're talking about character establishment, be careful not to talk about the development and resolution of the character. We're just focused on the establishment. So in our case, in our class, when we look at something like 10 Cloverfield Lane, we might look at the opening sequence, establishing Michelle's character, or we might look at how Howard has been established in that scene following the bunker, or not following the bunker, in the bunker. And in Waves, you could certainly talk about the way the characters Tyler and Alexis are established in the opening sequence and their relationship to one another. Of course, that is relationships, but it's an established relationship through the opening sequence. So you're going to generally be focused on the first few minutes of the films. Okay. Question 4. With reference to one of the media narratives you studied this year, compare how a contemporary audience may have consumed, engaged with, or read that narrative differently to the intended audience. So it doesn't suggest which narrative you need to study here, but obviously if you're going to compare audiences, contemporary and intended, then you're going to look at the historical narrative, in our case, 10 Cloverfield Lane, which is not that historic, but it is a lot has happened since 2016. So, most importantly here, the word one. I'll keep that going. We also need to think about one of these. Consumed, engaged with, or read. So just be aware that this or does suggest to you that you should only be mentioning one of these. And so if I'm going to assess this, I'm really going to just focus on the first one you reference. Consumed, engaged with, or read differently. And obviously you're going to make comparisons to audience readings or engagement and consumption. Okay. Question. Oh, by the way, just one more thing on this one. Sometimes engaging with something and reading something are very, very closely related. If you are reading and understanding and connecting to an idea that's presented in a narrative, then that's also going to engage you. But just make sure you're signposting with the word engagement to ensure that you're referencing the idea of being able to understand something, able to emotionally connect with something. Or if you're reading that connection, then just make sure you're signposting with the word read. Okay, next question. Question 5. Discuss how media narratives are shaped by the institutional context in which they are produced, distributed, consumed, or read. So same sort of thing. I don't know if this still works. Yep, so it's the or question. So we're looking at production, distribution, consumption, or reception. In your response, refer to one of the narratives you've studied this year, so you can choose whichever one you would like. The important thing about this is the institutional context, which is related to anything to do with the kind of production of the film, pre-production, the writing, the budget, the studios involved, the casting, anything to do with, or even the regulation and the distribution. So anything to do with the production of the film does impact on the actual narrative itself. So you could talk a little bit about the two films. You could talk about the Hollywood versus independent model there, and then what that might mean with respect to the structure of the narrative. So that's what it means by shaped. Part B. All media narratives are produced and understood in relationship to particular ideological contexts. So this is a 12-mark question. I'll read it properly. Analyze the relationship between ideological context and the construction of the narratives you studied this year. In your response, you should make reference to codes and conventions in two narratives. So, a few important words here. So, relationship, ideological context here, and the actual construction of the narrative. And I'm highlighting most of the question here. But mostly, we do need to make sure we're addressing both narratives, and we're going to embed codes and conventions in here. So it's a 12-mark question. We could really just think about this as two 6-mark questions. And again, we really want to probably here focus on the conventions within both films. But if you are going to focus on the conventions, so things like the way characters, the way the narrative is resolved, or the conflicts between characters, the narrative arcs, the character arcs, obviously that's going to focus on the conventions. But if you don't embed codes, then you're missing part of the question here. It is very likely that if you're not careful and you don't address this early, you may run out of time. So it's a 12-mark question. There's plenty of space. There's plenty of space to write here. It's 2 pages. This is not working for me very well. But just make sure you don't run out of time. Your readings that you've done around contexts, around historical contexts, through the time period of production is going to be really critical. So show evidence of your research, show evidence that you have a deeper understanding of ideologies here. Obviously be clear about what those ideologies are that you're identifying in each of those films, and then link those ideologies, that's the relationship, to the actual construction of the narrative. So most likely through the character conflicts, which is mostly where you see these ideological ideologies represented, and who essentially the conflict who is seen as the winners and losers in these conflicts. Okay, hopefully that was a little bit of help for you for the 2022 Narrative and Ideology SAC.